Mr. President, on this occasion of your birthday, this lovely lady is not only punctilious, but punctual. Mr. President, Marilyn Monroe. A woman about whom it truly may be said she needs no introduction. But let me just say, here she is. But I'll give her an introduction anyway, Mr. President, because in the history of show business, perhaps there has been no one female who meant so much, who has done more. Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
President, for all the things you've done, the battles that you've won, the way you deal with U.S. Steel and our problems by the ton. We thank you so much. Everybody, happy birthday!
President of the United States.
Thank you. I can now retire from politics after having had Happy Birthday sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way.
All righty. Happy Friday night, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good. Got a good show planned for you all this evening. A little snippet from 1961, I think that was, and maybe early 1962. Tonight we're going to be covering two different texts surrounding the very suspicious death of Marilyn Monroe. I'm going to be doing Mike Rothmiller's Bombshell, the night Bobby Kennedy killed Marilyn Monroe. And we're going to be referencing a little bit of the Maryland scandal as well. But this book was actually a little bit of a disappointment. But the first couple chapters actually covers some pretty in-depth stuff about the Kennedy administration subterfuge, involved with Marilyn Monroe, obviously. But this book is really good if you guys want to, follow up on everything that we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Kennedys, obviously. Going to be talking about Marilyn Monroe. Going to be talking about the LAPD. Going to be talking a little bit about our good friend Fidel Castro. and all these interesting characters that pop up in this book. This is the most recent, text that is pretty much covers the most recent text that's been published. I think it was published in 2021, so super up to date. And Mike Rothmiller, the co-author for this, was actually one of the agents, the investigators on the LAPD, kind of around the time, not immediately when Marilyn Monroe was deceased, but sometime after that, and he was granted access to the secret files, as well as a pretty chilling confession by Peter Lawford, who was actually there on the day Marilyn Monroe died, or was stamped out, I guess you could say. So just to kind of, I'll try to keep this relatively short, but it's going to be a bit of a ramble. Appreciate y'all joining me this evening. So if you guys aren't familiar with the Kennedys or Marilyn Monroe, there's a tremendous amount of, scholarly biographies covering, the Kennedy administration as well as Marilyn Monroe, obviously. And most of you guys are probably familiar with the controversial death of Marilyn Monroe and her affiliations with, JFK as well as Bobby Kennedy. She had an affair with both brothers. Pretty crazy shit. And, obviously what people don't know is that the LAPD was kind of involved in the cover-up, but obviously the cover-up came from Bobby Kennedy. And just to make a long story short, she had an affair with the president and his brother. But after a certain amount of time, kind of right after that happy birthday speech that was given, things started to get a little shaky. The Kennedy brothers kind of started shaking in their boots a little bit, and they're like, we got to cut Marilyn off. She's, it started to become a threat to national security, right? And that's kind of when the covert operations kind of come into this situation. And Bobby Kennedy actually showed up at Marilyn's house. It's pretty well documented, but back then it was, the evidence was hidden. And by the time we get to the end of this book, I'll pretty much explain how the whole thing went down. But Bobby Kennedy, I think John F. Kennedy actually kind of sent his brother Bobby there to sort of try to talk some sense into Marilyn. She was repeatedly making phone calls to the Oval Office trying to get a hold of the Kennedy brothers. And when she was kind of scorned or was not able to get through to them, she did start to tell people that she was threatening to go public with not only the affair, but she was going to leak national security secrets about the, Fidel Castro, Bay of Pigs, and all of that crazy stuff, the Cuban Missile Crisis, rather, and so they weren't having it, right? But also, interestingly, with Marilyn Monroe, I think it's important to remember that she was the mistress of the Kennedy brothers, but she also has affiliations with Lookout Mountain. If you guys are familiar with, Laurel Canyon, the Dave McGowan Scholarship, you know a little bit about Lookout Mountain. And also Marilyn sort of functioned as, like I said, not only the president's mistress, but also my conclusion is that she was sort of like an agent that the government could use as sort of a democratic, I would say, place where they could dump information. But she was also spied upon. They had, wiretappings going on, and Secret Service agents, all that kind of stuff, sort of monitoring Marilyn's moves within the Kennedy sort of kingdom. And they were all sort of being covertly spied on. The Kennedy brothers kind of were probably most likely aware of this latent subterfuge, this sort of spy tactics by various assets of the CIA, as well as the Oval Office, even the rogue sort of agents in the LAPD. But just kind of, we'll start with a couple good segments from Sandra Chevy's The Marilyn Scandal. Like I said, the overall book is more of just a biography of Marilyn's creative output. But the first couple chapters does sort of blow the lid on the Kennedy stuff. And this is dating back to 1989. This book was published. And, I'd also recommend you watch History's Mysteries. The life, or I think it's called The Death of Marilyn Monroe, The Mysterious Death of Marilyn Monroe. That's a great starting point as well. But let's see here. Rapaciously inquisitive, her intelligence matured at an astonishing pace. Both a zealous Democrat and a keen citizen, Marilyn followed politics and corresponded with Lester Markle, then editor of the New York Sunday Times. So not only was she kind of, affiliated with the Democratic Party, obviously she had connections in Hollywood, she had connections in the publishing, the media, the press, often complaining to him about news coverage and the lack of prominence given to some important stories. It is also worth noting the little-known fact that Roxbury, Connecticut, where Monroe was resident in 1960, nominated her as an alternate delegate to the Democratic Convention, indicating that those who knew and loved her took her very seriously. So she was sort of being promoted as this Democratic agent, kind of like we just stated, a sort of a vessel that the Democratic Party could use to filter out their, propaganda, I guess you could say, right? For the most part, however, she was misunderstood. The starlet was derided, whilst the superstar was vilified. Never properly acknowledged as a homicide, her appalling death is still an unexplained mystery. Robert Kennedy, who was then at the time the Attorney General, admitted to having entered her flat with Monroe's analyst on the afternoon of August 4th, 1962, because in his own words, she had been bothering my brother. Now, I did not hear... Mike Rothmiller didn't really cover any statements from the Kennedys. To my knowledge, they were pretty much under the code of omerta, as well as the LAPD. And we'll talk a little bit about omerta and how that kind of comes in. That's basically a silent code used by the mafia, but it was also sort of a latent, sort of a hidden practice of subterfuge among the officers of the LAPD, leaving us to wonder at the role he might have played in the tragedy, still officially regarded as suicide by the LAPD Attorney's Office. The case remains closed despite efforts by some to instigate an investigation to look into why her analyst, Dr. Greenson, who was also her psychiatrist, paying what was described as a routine house call for which the estate was later billed. Came together with Robert Kennedy bearing a hypodermic needle loaded with a tranquilizer. Now that's this is sort of like controlled opposition. To my knowledge, the updated scholarship says nothing about a tranquilizer, but if you read the little quote from the thumbnail of the stream, you'll see where Bobby Kennedy said, "Drink this, it'll make you feel better," and we'll get to that later. To my knowledge, there maybe a tranquilizer was prepared, but that was not allegedly used on Marilyn Monroe. Despite the widespread suggestion of foul play, Los Angeles society, government officials, police officers, film studio personnel, Hollywood communists, and medical practitioners all choose to give credence to the suicide theory, citing Marilyn as having a wanton, self-destructive personality. So we have this propaganda in the media and by the LAPD and by the analysts that sort of promoted this idea that Marilyn was at a sort of a tough turning point in her career, and she sort of was taking, Nebutol, and she was kind of a borderline drug addict. She took a lot of sleeping pills, but there's no indication that Marilyn had any plans to commit suicide, but she was sort of an easy target for that narrative, right? This book will attempt to show that far from being a suicidal type, Marilyn survived several calculated attempts to undermine her physical and mental equilibrium. Rejected and vilified, her body lay unclaimed for days on a slab in the city morgue with only a name tag for a talesman knotted around her big toe. Both Miller and DiMaggio were contracted, but neither of them made an immediate effort to redeem the body. Says here, when it came to reading of the will, it was discovered that there was very little capital left, which prevented beneficiaries from receiving anything. So that's just a little financial tidbit there. So some of that is true and some of it's not true. Marilyn was at a turning point. She had sort of a rebellious reputation in Hollywood. But all of that extraneous stuff about her career and, she allegedly there was previous suicide attempts. Nobody really knows. But what's up, Jay? Shout out to Jay. Thanks for joining. What's up, Katie? How you doing? Hope you all are enjoying this. Hope you'll stick around for a little bit. So she talks a little bit more about the Kennedys here. She says, I approach Monroe's relationship with President John Kennedy with some trepidation, but I do so to refute claims that she was a one-night stand, a VIP call girl, or the mistress to both brothers. So this woman's alleging that she wasn't a mistress to both Bobby and John, but it's pretty clear that she was. I will also discuss Robert Kennedy's involvement in her death, citing reasons why I believe it was not suicide. So this was before, this author obviously did not have the access that Mike Rothmiller does, and yeah, Mike Rothmiller obviously had much more access to the secret files, and he was actually got, an alleged confession by Peter Lawford. We'll talk more about Peter Lawford at some point here. Marilyn Monroe tried to commit suicide there, but she managed to contact the Cell Nevada operator in time to be rushed to the hospital to have her stomach pumped. So that was that was some more fake news that sort of was leaked to the press. She was secretly hospitalized, not inherently destructive, but psychologically oppressed. Monroe's final days have been described as abysmal. An unremitting fear of being compromised made her suspicious of anyone soliciting employment in her domicile. In other ways, too, her behavior grew bizarre. So that's kind of what led the Kennedys to sort of undertake this secret mission. Now, obviously, they've been spying on her, and basically during pillow talk or whatever, John and Bobby both, probably mostly John, started to sort of, unveil his national security secrets, his plans for the Democratic Party, his plans for, the civil rights movement, his plans it's alleged that he was planning to assassinate Fidel Castro. And of course, we have the whole thing with Lee Harvey Oswald. But if you guys are convinced Lee Harvey Oswald was working alone, then, I don't think he was. I think Fidel Castro potentially got to him first, or there's also other rumors, sort of conspiracies that, the Kennedy administration was sort of planning to audit the Federal Reserve, right? And the Federal Reserve was like, we're not having any of this. So they maybe potentially took out John Kennedy. So obviously the topic of this stream is not going to be so much focused on the JFK assassination. Maybe we'll get to that later on. We're going to talk about sort of the subterfuge that's involving Marilyn Monroe. It says here, did Marilyn intend to hold a press conference to embarrass the Kennedys politically? Legend cites her as a security risk in possession of a diary detailing important political secrets. Press agent Newcomb denies the existence of any such diary, but that diary is proven to be real, especially in Mike Rothmiller's account. And Bobby Kennedy, in his moment of truth, failed to mention it in an important police deposition, although the widely preemptive powers he evoked on that fatal night imply it was the impression he wished to convey. My own thinking is that it was a red herring induced to justify the use of political imperatives to cope with a situation which had become a personal embarrassment to the Kennedys. And the opening segment of the stream, when Marilyn Monroe was, drinking champagne and taking pills and sort of exuded this, it's pretty obvious that she was, just by that performance, that she was sort of trying to titillate, JFK. But by that point, JFK was obviously still kind of playing ball with her. But after a while, and obviously Marilyn Monroe is not the only woman that he had affairs with. He was, fairly promiscuous. It's quite amazing that despite his bizarre involvement in the last few hours of her life, that not only was Bobby Kennedy never publicly investigated, but he mounted a successful primary campaign to get the Democratic presidential nomination, and assuredly have got it had he not been assassinated. So obviously we had JFK's assassination followed by Bobby's assassination, which is pretty, and you can, it's just, to me, it's evocative of just this secret spy death cult that these people in the upper echelons of American political society were pretty much engaged in. Right? I mean, we had the death of Marilyn Monroe kind of out of the blue. She's affiliated with the Kennedys, and then JFK gets assassinated not long after that. Not long after that, Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated. And then not long after that, we have the death of Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was actually was a victim of the spy network, the covert operations, but he was also a sex addict and all this kind of stuff. So whenever you're looking at these supposed heroic American figures in politics or media, there's always tends to be kind of a dark underbelly that sort of takes place. And as tragic as what happened to Marilyn was, I did want to state for the record that I think Marilyn was not stupid, and she was kind of willingly playing with fire. She kind of knew what she was getting involved in. Yeah, she was troubled for sure, but she was not stupid, right? But I mean, she's kind of presents herself as this, blonde bimbo, that sort of thing, and she genuinely believed that she was going to pursue a romantic relationship with the Kennedys, but obviously it didn't happen like that. So just fast forwarding a little bit here. She was married to. Okay, so here's sort of where Peter Lawford kind of comes into the situation. Peter Lawford was kind of like it says here. The lovers would also frequently use Peter Lawford's house, beach house on Malibu and Santa Monica, where Marilyn would meet up with, the Kennedy brothers. And Peter Lawford is kind of like this. He's maybe somewhat of a handler, but he is obviously being handled by the covert operations himself. But he sort of acts as this sort of agent, or this, obviously he's a famous actor, ended up drinking himself to death. Mike Rothmiller's thesis is that the guilt that Peter Lawford carried over the murder of Marilyn Monroe basically led to Peter Lawford's alcoholism. So they met up at Peter Lawford's house sort of, secretly. The Lawford's role was somewhat of a pimp, was confirmed by an interview his last wife, Deborah Gould, gave to the BBC, in which she alluded to his collaboration in removing from Monroe's flat anything linking her with the Kennedys. Peter and Pat divorced following JFK's assassination. It is generally thought that Pat Lawford, his wife, who had been a close friend of Marilyn, felt badly about her husband's actions and connections with Marilyn's death. So there was some more evidence right there. While he was a senator, Kennedy had far fewer security restrictions than when he became president. So their affair, obviously, was alleged affair, well, a pretty proven affair. It started while he was a senator, right? But by the time he became president, he kind of realized that he was playing with fire and he needed to kind of nip this shit in the bud, for national security purposes. Later, it proved too accessible, and Monroe found the Secret Service men intrusive. So Monroe was being gang stalked pretty much by the Secret Service, by these covert spy operations, tightly connected to the Kennedys. But the Kennedys were also being spied on by these, pseudo entities that we'll get into. Mostly the Los Angeles Police Department. And obviously, the LAPD is known for their corruption throughout history, dating all the way back to the Black Dahlia cover-up, Black Dahlia murder. It says here, Kennedy was probably the first White House nudist. He apparently loved to sit around naked, and he and Marilyn would visit the nude beaches at Malibu, Monroe wearing a dark wig and Kennedy donning a beard, sunglasses, and baseball cap. So, just kind of, they were sort of acting as secret, they were sort of performing their own dance of covert operations, disguising themselves, meeting up at secret locations with Peter Lawford. So my annotation here says Jackie Kennedy was sort of the co-facilitator of John's affair. So, okay, yeah, so everybody knows about Jackie Kennedy, the fall of Camelot. But Jackie Kennedy was definitely aware of her husband's proclivities. And obviously back then, it would be very hard to get away with something like this now. But on the flip side, obviously we're going through the Stormy Daniels Donald Trump trial as we speak. And regardless of how irrelevant, Donald Trump's sex life really is, it just goes to show you that absolute power corrupts. If you want to look at that as a form of corruption, I mean, if Donald Trump is banging a porn star, I could really care less. It's alleged that Joe Biden is doing much worse than that. So who knows? It just kind of, this shit has been going on since the Kennedy administration, and it's obviously going on now. So nothing new there. If Kennedy was considering a second term, as it appears that he was, he could not afford to create a scandal. And if public recognition of Marilyn was tantamount to a risk of scandal, then Kennedy would have to reevaluate his relationship with Monroe. The popular picture of Jacqueline Kennedy as an aloof, elegant lady is deceptive. On more than one occasion, she is known to have put an end to Jack's affairs. Monroe was preceded in his affections by a similar type of girl. Curiously, for all his sex appeal, Jack Kennedy was attracted to offbeat women. I don't know what she means by that. His fascination with Marilyn had probably much to do with her appealing quality of tentiveness as it did with her body measurements. So just some interesting anecdotes there. It says Jackie's friend told me was mercurial. She would remain silent about Jack's philandering, and then all of a sudden she would lay down the law. So, but obviously she was not 100% privy to the affair with Marilyn, but obviously she wasn't able to stop it. This is interesting here. The relationship began shortly after Marilyn's death, so this is another woman that he had an affair with named Miss Meyer, until Kennedy's assassination a year later. Ironically, Miss Myers was also the victim of an assassin's bullet the following year. So this is just like open, covert murder, you know, like we talked, well, like the title of the stream, covert operations, murder, and subterfuge. I mean, it's crazy. And, you know, of course, when you go to school, elementary, middle school, high school, you know, the Kennedy administration is sort of propped up as these advocates of social justice, you know, advocates for all kinds of sort of democratic endeavors that took place. And whether or not we want to dispute the fact that the Kennedys maybe did some good things, I think that's pales in comparison to the acts of you know, subterfuge and murder and chaos that were going on in Camelot. The constancy and doggedness in Monroe's calls to the Justice Department and the White House during early June and August of 1962 are revealed by her telephone bills, which were confiscated at the time of her death, but surfaced later on when James Bacon obtained copies. The persistency of the calls suggests a panic whose origins almost certainly derive from the fact that Marilyn was pregnant. It's alleged that she was pregnant with Bobby Kennedy's child, possibly JFK's child. A theory supported by the fact that the following abortion on July 20th, there was only one final call lasting 8 minutes made to the Justice Department. Struggling to complete Something's Gotta Give, Monroe's mental health deteriorated along with her physical condition. She refused. The managers refused to renew Monroe's sleeping tablet prescription, triggering symptoms of forced withdrawal. Thirdly, she had discovered she was pregnant, hadn't the faintest notion of what to do. Annotation down below says pregnant with likely JFK baby. So another type of subterfuge that was going on. So this book, like I said, the first couple chapters do a really good job of sort of illustrating some of the early, the knowledge that was available at the time. On this trip, however, a minimum of small talk was made. This is talking about when Kennedy arrived and at Marilyn Monroe's house in 1962, August of 1962. Kennedy, coming straight to the point, stopped bothering John. Whatever else was said, whatever accusations or recriminations uttered, we shall never know. But it's actually much more evidence has come to light. Basically, Bobby Kennedy barged in, and I don't think they basically showed up. I think they were trying to give her one last chance to keep her fucking mouth shut, right? But she wouldn't. They had an altercation. Bobby Kennedy basically screamed into her face. He said, "What do you want?" They was trying to offer her money to stay quiet. There's alleged that they were maybe planning on giving her some type of putting her into like a mental facility. But I think he pretty much knew that this was a done deal, and we'll get to what kind of took place later on. There's a little antidote about the Kennedys here. Coming straight to the point, stop bothering John. Whatever else was said, whatever accusations or recriminations uttered, we shall never know. What we do know is that whatever went on between Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn inflamed an already aggravated situation to the extent that, according to Kennedy, she clawed at him when he held her so that the doctor could inject a tranquilizer. Now, allegedly that never really took place. They never injected her with a tranquilizer, but that was sort of a false confession by somebody or some type of false police report. Maybe there was a tranquilizer, but it was never mentioned in the more modern text. They must have been decided resistance by Monroe, but it's a pretty similar sort of situation, right? So this is dating back almost 35, 40 years ago. So based on the evidence that this author had, it's fairly accurate. The sound. Can you guys hear me now? Me now. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I think we're good. I think I need a new USB cord or something. Just give me a thumbs up if the sound is back on. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Double check my live stream here. Just give me a thumbs up. All right, I can hear me. Hopefully, how long was the power out? Let me know. I think I just touched something and the cord got all screwed up. So anyway, you guys might have missed the little introduction about Mike Rothmiller. But we're going to start dissecting this text here. It says here, truth, like all material, can be squeezed and bent, angled, and cut into whatever shape is required. What conclusions need to be drawn, which lives and careers need to be saved, and which are quite dispensable. Rarely has it been twisted so expertly as in the death of Marilyn Monroe, who died in 1962. All right, let's see here. LAPD police intelligence files and first-hand and previously unheard testimony from the man who was present at the end of Marilyn Monroe's life, the man who watched her die, a.k.a. Peter Lawford. It dismisses the bespoke truth offered for decades by Hollywood and Washington and tabloid clairvoyants to explain the connected, impenetrable mystery about the death of Marilyn Monroe and her associations, involvement with President JFK and his brother. So even within sort of the alleged conspiratorial murder, even within that genre, there was, from the powers that be, they released sort of like had like a breadcrumbing campaign. They would release a little bit of disinformation at a time. 4 or 5 years later, release a little bit more of some more disinformation, misinformation, to sort of clutter up the whole what really took place. This book asserts that Robert Kennedy and Peter Lawford were with Marilyn when she died. Now, whether or not this alleged confession by Peter Lawford actually happened, I guess you could, that's up for debate, or whether or not, if it did happen, was Peter Lawford just crazy and he was just trying to get he wasn't trying to get publicity, though, I'll tell you that much. We'll get into that later. Their involvement in her death becomes rigorously clear as the pages turn. The story of Marilyn Monroe and her sexual encounters with President Kennedy and her affair with Bobby Kennedy unfold with chilling clarity. For the first time, we hear talk of them in her diary of making love to President Kennedy and falling in love with his brother. So he could never have imagined, never have believed that years later he would be the person to have uncovered the answers to the greatest questions surrounding her death, or known that such knowledge would perhaps cost him his life. So Mike Rothmiller, the detective, the author of this book, actually ended up getting gang stalked. Somebody tried to run him off the road. Those are sort of the secret agents, subterfuge agents that work for the LAPD, right? So this is a pretty dense book, but it's pretty easy to get through. The print is really great. Smells really great. It's brand new. So the first section of the book, sort of another thing that I have to tell you guys about, is the Organized Crime Intelligence Division, which was, like we said previously, kind of a rogue enterprise within the LAPD that sort of orchestrates all the cover-ups, right? And it's been going on since probably the birth of the LAPD. And obviously the LAPD is not the only sort of police department that has these cover-ups. Every sort of police department is sort of a rogue agency to a point, In time, Mike Rothmiller would come to learn that the official conclusion of Monroe as a suicide was absurd. So there's a lot of highlighted here. We have some stuff about the Hillside Strangler, discarding people around Los Angeles freeway system, a man who had led, organized, and controlled the 1975 inquiry into Monroe's death. Darrell Dates was now chief of police. He signed off on Mike Rothmiller's promotion and assignment to work as an undercover detective for Gates' old command. the Organized Crime Intelligence Division. As a rookie spy and the youngest detective in the division, Rothmiller was designated desk office duty for his first weeks in the intelligence unit. So that's kind of how Mike Rothmiller eventually became privy to. He sort of earned all the trust of these sort of entities within the LAPD, and that's when he sort of covertly started. He's sort of a covert agent himself, right? A secret covert agent trying to uncover the death of Marilyn Monroe. But so much time had passed. The Kennedys had died. The Kennedy dynasty, Kennedy family is not nearly as powerful as they once were. So that was one sort of inspiration for him to kind of uncover the truth, that the police department had changed a lot. A lot of the official sort of goons were long deceased by then. The people that were in Maryland circle were long. So it was kind of like an old sort of conspiracy that was now, sort of the powers that be. They had all the files locked up in a secret file. And basically Mike Rothmiller's sort of process to get to the death of to get to the truth behind the death of Marilyn Monroe was that he extensively researched all the secret files. He did conduct a lot of interviews with what was left of the fat cats or whatever that were on the LAPD at the time of Monroe's death. Maybe he got the coroner's report, he got all the secret spy information that had taken place, but lastly but not leastly, he was granted an interview, a kind of a secret covert interview with Peter Lawford, where Peter Lawford kind of spilled the beans. Says here, only a half a dozen steps away from Rothmiller's desk was a wall holding what at first glance appeared to be a set of giant locked bookshelves, but up close they were overloaded floor to ceiling with rolls containing thousands upon thousands of secret dossiers. Nearby was a series of chest-high filing cabinets holding the keys to the dossiers. Even if he felt a little like Aladdin, he didn't need an open sesame to access the contents. Inside these filing cabinets were names on index cards with a code system linking to the corresponding files stored on the shelves. There were thousands of cards dating back nearly 5 decades. Rothmiller had time and worked out the filing codes and how they related to the location of each set of files. So basically like putting together this secret puzzle that the LAPD never wanted anybody to know. Many were cross-referenced. The subject could have been dead for years, but their file kept growing and remained active, granted immortality within the OCID, Organized Crime Intelligence Division, if any associate remained alive, as the local industry, Hollywood, and all its players were overwhelmingly repressed. My annotation here says mirrors Dave McGowan's work on true crime cover-ups. That's something else we see within sort of the serial killer investigative realm is, hoarding of evidence, sort of, how do I say, reevaluation of evidence, just subterfuge, or sort of hoarding evidence to sort of dictate the narrative on crimes and so on and so forth. The chief of police also maintained a secret file on all media reporters and news executives in Southern California. It is understood that secret media file was still being used in 2021. Mike Rothmiller's initial assignment was bureaucratic ritual, but when he had finished sharpening pencils, he began reading the classified files. So somehow Mike Rothmiller was granted privy to some of these secret files, right? I remember when my mother, when I was growing up, my dad was trying to get tenure at the local university. He was gone away all the time. He was having meetings with colleagues, and my mother was convinced that he was involved in some kind of covert affair with one of his colleagues or whatever. And my mother would come into the computer room and unplug all the computers and say, "My dad, your father's got secret files in here," and she would just fuck with my dad. It was crazy shit. So, but anyway, the idea of secret files, it's kind of a real thing in this case, obviously. This cache of secrets he now had unencumbered access to changed his perception of so much of what he and the rest of the world had been led to believe. Along with salacious, detailed political and Hollywood scandals of the evidence of the cover-up surrounding Marilyn Monroe's death, the civic leaders had deemed it was a suicide or possibly an accidental overdose. Yet Mike Rothmiller now believed that Marilyn Monroe's death was in no way self-inflicted, obviously. So he's kind of siphoning through the the secret files, right? Okay, so there's a little reference here. You guys might be familiar with some of this stuff. One Organized Crime Intelligence Division report details a sex party held at Frank Sinatra's secluded and recreational home in the San Fernando Valley. Frank Sinatra was obviously a part of this, part of these covert operations. Recreational home in San Fernando Valley at the top of Winnetka Boulevard and Encino, where it dead ends at the Santa Monica Mountains, as well as a stable of active young women. There was unlimited alcohol and limited drugs. The reported listed party guested included Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, John Kennedy, and others. Interesting guests, but a Hollywood sex party will surprise few. He's like trolling there because everybody knows about the secret parties. So we also have this other individual. It says the relationship between President Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and Marilyn Monroe met all the criteria for LAPD spying. So it was basically like a national security accident waiting to happen. Now, and this kind of reminds you of why Marilyn was maybe involved in that covert location in Laurel Canyon, Lookout Mountain, according to David McGowan, right? So was she sort of under some type of mind control? Was she sort of offered some type of incentive to collaborate as sort of a agent of deception to the Kennedys, perhaps? Or just got heavily involved with it? Was she sort of prepped or prepared? Because you got to ask yourself, like, it's almost like somebody maybe groomed her in the political sphere, the political spectrum, in order to be able to sort of function in this political society. It would have been very difficult for just the average actor to kind of be able to do that. So she had to sort of have been prepared to enter sort of that realm, to be able to interact with them a little bit. Ultimately, the only cops who mattered knew almost every secret and kept them in the OCID files, which was where Mike Rothmiller discovered the exactitude of the complex circumstances and cause of Marilyn Monroe's death. So we have another individual, Captain James Hamilton, very much saw himself as the Kennedys' protector, especially of Bobby, with whom he established a strong relationship. So the Kennedys were basically like this with the LAPD. The Kennedys kind of covered for them, represented them, in Congress or whatever, and the LAPD would basically, scratch the Kennedys back whenever they were in town. It says one OCID report. Okay, so we just read that. So we have a lot of individuals that were covertly spied on, but they kind of set all these people up sort of to basically to covertly spy on them, right? Okay, so here we have it says here, Marilyn Monroe was quoted as saying, or a quote from Marilyn Monroe saying, "I'm going to tell the world about them. They used me. I'm not a whore." So Marilyn Monroe was getting very, very upset at this point. The wiretaps heard it all. She was going to go public with her Kennedy affairs. A concerned Jose Bolanos warned her against it, especially revealing national security details she knew from JFK's remarks about Cuba and Castro. Marilyn talked to lots of people on the phone that day and into the evening, including Peter Lawford, although the official telephone company records of these calls swiftly vanished. In her diary on August 3rd, 1962, she noted, "Peter said Robert will come tomorrow. I don't know if he will." So it's basically proven right there from Monroe's secret diary that Bobby Kennedy was supposed to be coming over that morning. Much had gone on after the event, and all of it to cover up what did happen. That trick of shaping events to however you want them to appear. All right, so we do have this is not the full sort of monologue, but it says here, I think this is what is this here? Something about Marilyn, the president, and Bobby are dead. So are many others. I know Marilyn's death was not your fault. So this is Mike Rothmiller sort of trying to coax sort of convince Peter Lawford to, because he basically, it was a pretty well-known fact within the LAPD that Peter Lawford was, sort of in cahoots with these people. He was there on that day. He was kind of like Marilyn Monroe's right arm man, sort of like her wingman, right? Mike Rothmiller's trying to sort of coax the truth out of him. I know Marilyn's death was not your fault. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a long time ago. So Peter Lawford probably was not 100% privy to the fact that they were trying to kill Marilyn that day. He was sort of brought along just maybe as somebody to try to comfort Marilyn or try to maybe talk some sense into Marilyn, because Bobby Kennedy needed sort of a buffer, right? He wasn't going to show up there alone. Of course, we have the sketchy housekeeper that confessed that Bobby Kennedy was there. And it says here, according to Mike Rothmiller, this is kind of where the whole book kind of unfolds, and he told me right there what really happened on the night he watched Marilyn die. Talk a little bit about that. Okay, so just a little bit about Mike Rothmiller being gang stalked. I was the only witness that I know of, certainly the only one wearing a badge, who could testify that the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, had been in Los Angeles in the middle of the night, going in the wrong direction at high speed, trying to get out of town as fast as he could. So that's another thing, too. The Bobby Kennedy, he was in the car with somebody else. It might have been Peter Lawford, I think, but he was pulled over. They were pulled over in like a limousine or whatever, a secret vehicle, and we have this testimony from one of the LAPD police officers that said he saw Kennedy trying to leave town. So that's awfully sketchy. Mike Rothmiller also eventually found himself with information no one else knew. After their 1982 interview, he was aware that both he and Peter Lawford could be in danger. Today in 2021, Mike Rothmiller cannot be certain if there was a real attempt to kill him because of what he learned about the death of Marilyn Monroe and the cover-up to protect the Kennedy family. He had been involved in many risky undercover operations involving the mafia and the Mexican cartels, and the death threats were part of the job. So this is when Mike Rothmiller is being gang stalked. They burst a machine pistol, shattered the peace of the Orange County street in Mike Rothmiller's life. He'd sensed the hit seconds before it happened, braking and veering over a dirt embankment. Somebody was stalking him in a vehicle. So, LAPD gang stalking people. I'm going to fast forward a little bit so we can get to the meat of this. It talks a little bit about JFK's secret, well, not very secret sex addiction, but says Kennedy's hypersexuality was not limited to his presidential years, but also occurred in his college and congressional years before and after marriage. JFK always had a high sex drive, yeah, no shit, probably related to his hyperthymic temperament, later strengthened by libido-enhancing medications, anabolic steroids, and amphetamines. When Kennedy combined procaine injections with other agents that produced euphoria, like amphetamines and steroids, they all augmented one another, increasing his energy and libido further. It concludes that Kennedy used more drugs than he needed, which provided him with a manic-like enhancement of his physical and sexual energy. That is the scientific stuff. So, just a little, the Kennedys were sort of being pumped up on drugs to sort of potentially corrupt their endeavors, and we have that doctor, the Dr. Feelgood, that was affiliated with John F. Kennedy as well as Marilyn Monroe and Elvis, I believe, too. He's the guy that treated Elvis or gave Elvis stuff, too. Okay, so also Joe DiMaggio comes up here a little bit. You guys are familiar with Joe DiMaggio's marriage to Marilyn Monroe. He was somewhat of a spouse abuser, right? But when all was said and done, he was basically the only one at the end. He didn't really give a shit about Marilyn until she died, but he sort of conducted the funeral proceedings. He didn't let anybody into the funeral in the Hollywood or Kennedy circles. But Joe DiMaggio actually hired a private eye to kind of spy on Marilyn. Annotation here says Marilyn versus DiMaggio. Marilyn stalked by a private eye. So Joe DiMaggio was pretty possessive, even though he wanted to divorce her. So obviously you can see that Marilyn, we had some people in the chat basically saying that Marilyn Monroe was very troubled, right? And her failures in romance probably could have been prevented, or this whole thing with the Kennedys, rather, could have been prevented if she was able to rewind and have some type of successful romantic relationship, right? You know, she just got more and more into the deep end with more and more men of positions of power, and they basically maneuvered her into our corner and basically, you know, and like I said, I'm not trying to say that, you know, Marilyn was the complete victim, because she obviously was playing with fire and she kind of knew that, which nobody really wants to talk about. And she had numerous people warning her not to go public with this. So we have sort of the, you know, a little bit about Arthur Miller. Some more sex parties released, linked to the Kennedys here. It was a sexual merry-go-round. Part of that heavily male-dominated culture of the time was that men often passed around their conquests, like sharing a tip about a new restaurant. One FBI file records details of sex parties in the suite kept at the Caroline Hotel in New York. Mrs. Hammond had considerable information about the upmarket orgies. President Hoover, I guess, mesmerized by the sex lives of others, read the names of those who had participated. So that's another thing too, and that's kind of what, like, we have the whole thing with, we had that fake Russian collusion with Trump thing, which I think has, you know, on the secret dossier and all that. So these people, these presidential political figures, probably all have all kinds of dirt on each other. You know, that's kind of how it works. You know, they set each other up for political gain, and that's kind of what these. And then Peter Lawford shows up here. Peter Lawford's name had a telephone book of mentions in the FBI files, but the inclusion of Pat Kennedy Lawford raised eyebrows. She was on the radar of FBI surveillance, but previously there had been no indication, circumstantial or otherwise, of her involvement in such gatherings. The FBI certainly did not have the scale of information that was held in the OCID files, which recorded and kept every detail. So the FBI, as powerful as they potentially are or were, they were not as powerful as this rogue entity, the Organized Crime Intelligence Division of the LAPD. So the LAPD, the Organized Crime Intelligence Division, in collusion with the Kennedys, in collusion with their own police department, was almost, because of their sort of rogue, covert status, were more powerful than the FBI itself. Yo, what's up, Krista? How you doing? Thank you for joining the stream. Doing some Marilyn Monroe stuff. I do encourage you guys, if you're kind of coming in the middle, hopefully you'll stick it out with us till the end, but after the stream's over, go back to the beginning, kind of fills in some of the blanks for you. Appreciate y'all out there. Make sure you guys share this stream on your community post on YouTube. Just go to the share button, and then it'll give you the option to share the link via another social media platform, or you can create a post. I would appreciate that. Good way to get it in everybody's feed. I know some of you guys aren't very active on here, you know, but if you make content and you have your, you know, community post in rotation, it has a little bit of an audience, feel free to share this. I would appreciate it. Make sure you guys like up the stream. I would appreciate that very much. Many have attempted, and a few have arguably come close to explaining the conjuring act going on inside Marilyn Monroe's head, but it is clear that she was much taken, often giddy, and sometimes drunk on her own desirability. When she met up with Senator John Kennedy, her confidence, her seriousness was boosted beyond the fiction of her imagination. So that was, you know, sort of the catalyst for, you know, Marilyn was kind of a love rat herself, a love addict, but, you know, irresistible, but, you know, JFK and Bobby Kennedy. And what's interesting too, guys, is that, you know, in her diary, she sort of describes her sexual practices with both of, you know, John and Bobby, and she kind of went, as time went on, she went on to prefer Bobby because he was like sensitive. Bobby, you know, he was better at lovemaking or something, and JFK was on so many different drugs, and there's rumors that he was kind of in the process of becoming impotent or something, but he was kind of just like a dead fish, evidently, towards this time. When she met up with Senator John, blah, 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 they talked of world events in her diary. So JFK kind of was letting his guard down under the ruse of, I don't know what you would call it, post-orgasmic delusion. He starts spilling all the beans about Fidel Castro and Martin Luther King and all this crazy shit. So Marilyn Monroe is becoming privy, she's not only becoming privy to this information, but she's sort of forming her own sort of political, socio-political viewpoints too, right? But so if anybody ever questions the affairs that took place, I mean, it's all documented in her diary. Marilyn Monroe and that's also what Bobby Kennedy showed up on that fateful day of August 1962, was to he rummaged through Marilyn's house trying to find that secret diary. I suspect it was found somewhere. Annotation here says everyone in Marilyn, Lawford, and Kennedy circles were being covertly spied on. It says here, John Kennedy and Marilyn was another example of a Kennedy trophy F. You guys get what I'm saying? I don't want to say the F word. They sort of viewed her as a trophy buck, right? But her diary and the longevity of their liaisons tell a different story. For him, there was the excitement of the risk, as the one with Judith Exner, but Marilyn also brought something else he craved, something many overlook. She brought behind-the-scenes endorsements in the powerful and persuasive form of celebrity. He was attracted to the appeal, the glitter of attention, and he exercised his personal charisma with it. He campaigned on it, and it's shown in the reflected magnetism. Studying the history, what remains remarkable in his arrogance is his arrogance. In the late 1950s, Senator John Kennedy was preparing to make a run for the presidency of the United States, but was seen in restaurants with his hand up Marilyn Monroe's skirt. He went red when he realized I wasn't wearing panties, Marilyn said. So this gets into some pretty scandalous stuff. It was a different world, a sexual carnival, a Puritan game being played out, a prurient game. I don't know even how to say that word. But with secret cameras clicking and taping, quietly recording in utility vans and other disguised vehicles all across L.A. and elsewhere, Peter Lawford's Santa Monica beach home was under 24-hour watching and listening orders. So, like we said, Peter Lawford was sort of like the guy. He's sort of like the goon squad, subterfuge agent, right? He's sort of the one that sort of surrounds all these powerful people in the media and politics, and he sort of ushers them into these situations where they all become sort of covertly spied on. And to what extent is he privy to the fact that he's being gang stalked and covertly spied on, or is he kind of in league with the Organized Crime Intelligence Division of LAPD? So that remains to be seen. So it says that Judith Campbell, another young woman, sort of became a rival between Marilyn and JFK. All right, making pretty good time here. Appreciate y'all sticking around. Halfway through the book almost. Hope you guys are finding this interesting, and hopefully this is something you guys can talk about with your family members. With you go to a family dinner, maybe you can bring up like a lighthearted conspiracy. Hey, did you know that JFK and Bobby Kennedy were behind, the death of Marilyn Monroe? And I think Monroe. What's also interesting too is Monroe's legacy on the surface level is all about her celebrity, her beauty. And her whole, her sort of acting style, her acting repertoire, is sort of a topic you could talk about that on its own. Sort of the way that she presented herself as an entertainer, but she wasn't like an upper echelon entertainer, but she sort of had a certain magnetism behind the screen. But that pretty much pales in comparison to, her involvement in this whole socio-political secret scheme. Says here, during the early weeks of the Kennedy administration, medical treatment for Marilyn was ongoing. President Kennedy wanted to put a man on the moon and win the space race from Moscow was his main mission. So we got, space propaganda. Marilyn wrote twice in her diary about this. John told me about Castro and he must be stopped. The second read, John does not like Fidel Castro and said he will be gone soon. So again, JFK was potentially planning to out Fidel Castro. CIA officers testified in the years which followed that President Kennedy wanted to have executive action capability to deal with Castro by interference any other foreign leader who was deemed worthy of murdering. Kennedy Library documents and testimony indicate that long before the Kennedy administration planned what became the botched invasion of the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba, April 17, 1961, arrangements were being made to assassinate Castro. And that essentially, all of this covert information was being relayed to Marilyn Monroe after they had sex, basically. So that's another reason. It wasn't so much of the affair, like, yeah, that would have been a big deal, but it was the fact that Marilyn had secret intelligence information about the U.S. government and Fidel Castro. They could not risk that. And I think they basically told Monroe, please don't do this. But she was, it's kind of like something I would do if a woman breaks up with me. I'm going to, reveal all her secrets and all that. Because, a woman scorned, right? I guess I'm kind of like I'm like the scorned bitch, It's got me into some pretty hot water. So I kind of relate to Marilyn Monroe, But, obviously she was obviously playing with fire. Bobby Kennedy portrays himself as playing a leading role in the deliberations of a White House aide who read the manuscript in 1964, shortly after JFK's assassination, remarked, "I thought Jack was president during the missile crisis." Bobby, who was then campaigning for the U.S. Senate, replied, "He's not running, and I am." In death, the Kennedy brothers, especially John, achieved near canestation and a disproportionate weighing of legend and achievement. This has become more apparent with the release of classified information and previously unknown tape recordings of deliberation. So we have all kinds of different levels of covert ops. Not only with Marilyn, but also with the Kennedys, with Fidel Castro, and also some stuff involving the civil rights movement that we'll get into later. Can we get done by 11? We'll see here. So Marilyn buys a new house. And it's sort of where Dr. Greenson comes up. So she gets this sketchy psychiatrist under the name of Dr. Ralph Greenson, who has a who has a history of hypnotism, dealing in post-traumatic stress with Vietnam patients, or probably more like World War II patients, but he's sort of like a pseudo doctor, right? Now, even though this stream is not about Ralph Greenson, I think it's important to mention him. Dr. Greenson was visiting Marilyn almost every day, a $50 visit, and it kind of reminds me when we did the thing about Britney Spears, right? And how the conservatorship basically forced her into this regimented psychoanalytical ritual treatment, right? And this is basically what was going on with Marilyn Monroe, too. Visiting Monroe every day and trying to help her break her sleeping pill habit, just as Dr. Engelberg. That's the secret. That's sort of the covert doctor that was working. That's the Dr. Feelgood that we were talking about. Dr. Engelberg, I think, was writing prescriptions for even more drugs to get her to rest and sleep. So they were kind of putting Marilyn Monroe in a questionable position under the influence of Nebutol or whatever sleeping drugs she was given her. No wonder she said she got confused. Dr. Greenson was fashionable. Patients included Vivian Leigh, Tony Curtis, and revealingly Frank Sinatra, and one of the original couch jockey psychiatrists in post-war California. Psychoanalysts in Beverly Hills were perfect partners. So kind of another covert, we have these sort of elite doctors that work in unison with all different kinds of celebrities. He was a known follower of Freud, of course. Hypnotism was one of his treatments. Dr. Greenson also had success treating soldiers returning from war from post-traumatic stress. He employed, those are kind of like his sort of, connections to the military-industrial complex. Dr. Greenson also had success. He employed the truth drug, sodium pentanol, but in many cases it wasn't a cure but a haphazard release of symptoms. Nevertheless, he was regarded as a pioneer in these vogue treatments and lauded in Hollywood as a status symbol. You must see Dr. Greenson, people said. If Peter Lawford issued an invitation to a party, it often meant his wife was, okay, a little anecdote on Peter Lawford, but that's Dr. Greenson in a nutshell. Yes, we did have Lawford's house wired. Yes, I did hear a tape of JFK effing Monroe, but I don't want to get into the moans and groans of their relationship. They were having a sexual relationship, period. This wasn't information America was ready for. No matter how brazen they had been before, Kennedy was president now, and this didn't fit his clean-cut, all-American boy White House image. It was avoided rather than denied, as much as there are those who do not want to accept that Rock Hudson was gay. It was Fred Otash, a nightcrawler in Hollywood, moving about the city in a Cadillac with a driver who first got the relations. A little anecdote about Rock Hudson. Says his reports here confirmed John and Bobby both had a sexual relationship with Marilyn. I don't understand. That's just so, like, borderline incestual. I don't know how brothers could share a woman. That I just could never get into that. A little picture of Dr. Greenson there, as well as the weird, Marilyn's housekeeper. One person who knew almost of all Hollywood secrets and possessed the knowledge photographs and covertly recorded conversation from the telephone wiretaps and bugs he planted in homes and offices. So it's just hard to imagine that there was this much subterfuge kind of taking place. But, it's interesting to speculate, too, if Marilyn had stayed out of the Kennedy circle, if she kind of wasn't... but like I said, we talked about the whole thing with Lookout Mountain, and nobody really knows the extent of what actually took place there. So was Marilyn Monroe sort of born to sort of be a victim of the socio-political, military-industrial complex, or did she kind of fall into it under naivety and stupidity and being at the wrong place at the wrong time? So it says here, the elites wiretapped and covertly spied on... Every time I say covert... Take a drink. Covertly spied on government officials, celebrities, etc. He bugged a few rooms in Lawford's beach house, kept secret from Lawford's wife, Pat. The bugging was done so Lawford could excuse himself from a meeting, go to another room, and secretly listen to the conversations happening in his absence. It's an old tried and true business and government tactic, however, being Fred... So it wouldn't surprise me if Lawford was... has some type of other connections other than just being an actor. He was obviously a government agent of sorts. Scores of movie stars, Hollywood movers, and shankers, and of course the Kennedys all spent time at Lawford's beach house. So Lawford's secret beach sex party house was kind of like the center for spyware, the center for spy endeavors. When I pressured him on some sensitive details and relationships, Fred began to experience selective memory lapses. So a lot of people are just drawing blanks. They're all of a sudden becoming dumb. This is during sort of the investigate. These are quotes that he's taking throughout the whole history of the Marilyn Monroe investigation, but also the particular one conducted by Mike Rothmiller as well. Lawford acts as a covert agent, handler, spy. Yeah, so we kind of already said that. That's my annotation. The Organized Crime and Intelligence Division and the CIA working together was not unusual. During my tenure within the Organized Crime and Intelligence Division, I and many others had contact with CIA officers and agents. There were a few OCID detectives who were, for want of a better term, paid part-time CIA operatives. So we have CIA, bad actors in the LAPD. There's no big shock there. So those are sort of Lawford's connections to the CIA. Installed bugs in a wiretap of Lawford's home. Why not? Ask him how he came to be in the pay of the CIA, and on this he suffered a complete memory loss, admitted that he believed his CIA contact worked with an OCD detective. Installing the bugs and wiretap in her home was very simple. 2 telephone company technicians on his payroll disabled her telephone when she was out of town. The techs went to the house shortly afterward and informed the caretaker that they were to repair the phone. It was natural and convincing cover. They spent several hours in the house installing bugs and wiretaps on her telephone. It was a perfect operation. Marilyn never suspected a thing. It was then a simple matter of recording conversations, making copies, and delivering the information to receive payment. So even back then, bugging somebody's phone is, I guess, much easier now, but back then they obviously had ways of obviously doing that too. Is there too much headroom here? Whatever. So let's fast forward a little bit. Coming up on 10:45. Okay, so there's an interesting book called The Dark Side of Camelot. I haven't read it yet, but sort of talks a little bit more about espionage and so on and so forth. Okay, so Marilyn was clinging to hope. It says here, somewhere in that mist, Marilyn had decided Bobby Kennedy was meant for her. She'd been rejected by one brother, but felt she was secure with another. Their regular liaisons, including a 4th of July celebration together at the Lawford Beach House, fanned for her that absurdity. So Marilyn was kind of living in a delusion of grandeur, obviously, right? I don't think any of the Kennedy brothers, I don't think John ever loved her. It's possible Bobby loved her, and there's obviously, we talked previously in the stream how there was secret abortions. You know, she was obviously pregnant with maybe both, at least one of their kids. Maybe Bobby was catching feelings, but he could not afford to catch feelings for Marilyn Monroe because of just everything that would have taken place. Bobby Kennedy became more and more indiscreet with his visits to Maryland. The Lawford Beach House was seen as a safe haven, guarded as it always was by the OCID, but the Lawfords had neighbors and help, valet parkers, and deliveries. Bobby's affections for Marilyn had already become quite apparent at his brother's Madison Square Garden birthday party. So they're both, all three of these individuals, the Kennedy brothers, and also in addition to Marilyn Monroe, were just all sort of, acting recklessly, right? But they all knew what they were getting into. Bobby Kennedy also had his personal and close CIA agents. Chief among them was William Harvey. The U.S. tensions with Cuba became more and more threatening to world peace, and there would just be 100 days before Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn's 4th of July weekend to the Cuban Missile Crisis. William Harvey took charge of facilitating the Kennedys' obsession with crushing Castro in February of 1962, along with responsibility for covert actions, sabotage, and subversion against Cuba. And Marilyn was Bobby's girl, this says, she most certainly thought she was, yet their romance was not rosy. Fred Otash's wiretaps captured angry conversations between the two, usually because Bobby Kennedy could not fulfill an arrangement he made to see her. Marilyn thought she was more important than government business. At times, it appears Bobby Kennedy thought the same. So, interesting. It says here, it was remarkable how much expertise was deployed in subterfuge and how clever it was. It has taken decades to reveal the truth about the attempts to assassinate Castro, the misogynistic debauchery of the Kennedys, so skillfully camouflaged by Colgate grins, and the collegiate hidden society of enablers in the murder of Marilyn Monroe. Fast forwarding here. Okay, so there is another unfortunate event that took place. There's this one actor here. What's his fucking name? Sam Giancana. So basically they had a secret party at, I forgot where it was, but of course all the usual suspects were there. Sinatra, Giancana, our boy, what's his fucking name? Drawing a blank. Who's the guy? Peter Lawford. Marilyn was allegedly drugged and sort of assaulted by a group of individuals, and allegedly there were some covert photographs taken of this secret crime that took place. Pretty shocking stuff. I'm not going to get too much into that because it's, it kind of diverts a little bit into the text here about that, but just all kinds of crazy stuff. From Marilyn's diary, he noted the following. Marilyn sort of wrote here, Frank, Peter, and others were there. Frank said, I can't. So she did have sort of this sort of sketchy, this was sort of towards when things were starting to fall apart, but she got into sort of an altercation with Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra basically told her to keep her mouth shut or something. But she wrote in her diary, I was drunk. I don't remember what happened that night. Did I have sex? ? Intelligence files regarding her weekend at the lodge clearly stated she was drunk and forced to depart early, reports Mike. So Marilyn Monroe was obviously getting more and more sort of reckless. She was sort of falling under the spell of all these, bad actors. It must be noted that the CIA had requested Sam Giancana and his mob associates to assassinate Cuba's Fidel Castro. Robert Kennedy and President John Kennedy both knew and approved of the assassination plot, so the mafia is involved in this too. Also, we have a little. Mike Rothmiller goes on this little monologue about Dorothy Kilgallen, who obviously died under mysterious circumstances, and she was, I think, covertly privy to the information about not only Marilyn Monroe but also the Kennedys, and she was maybe planning to write a book about it, and then conveniently she dies of an overdose, like they all do. So there's another book called The Life and Curious Death about Marilyn Monroe. There's no mention of Peter Lawford or indeed any condolence messages from President Kennedy, whom she had sung so sweetly for only weeks earlier. So this is after Marilyn's death. We're fast forwarding a little bit. What's interesting in that beginning clip that we featured, the guy announces Marilyn Monroe as the late Marilyn Monroe, which is pretty weird. Lawford was smuggled away out of the city and flown to Hyannis Port. He was never interviewed by the police until years and years and years later. He was never interviewed by the police or the coroner's office at that time. Detective Sergeant R.E. Bryan, who is mentioned in the Los Angeles Times report, is the signatory on a file note that Maryland investigation. An attempt was made to contact Mr. Lawford, but officers were informed by his secretary that Mr. Lawford had taken an airplane at 1 p.m. So it's unknown at the time the exact destination. However, his secretary stated that she did not expect to hear from him, and she would request that he contact his department at his earliest convenience. So not only did Bob Kennedy, we'll get into what happened here. Got Dr. Engelberg again. See if we can get to Lawford's confession here. Okay, so basically this is a transcript of the conversation between... Now this interview that took place with the author Mike Rothmiller and Peter Lawford was probably dating back to sometime before Peter Lawford died. I'm assuming maybe 80s, maybe early 90s. And this book, obviously he didn't come out with this book right after he did the interview. He had to wait, I don't know, 15, 20 years. Mike Rothmiller was probably, he was a really young detective around the time he started working for the LAPD. Marilyn was hysterical and crying when Kennedy stormed out of the bedroom. Lawford was stunned by Kennedy's actions at a loss to explain his violent outburst. He didn't know what he should do. He helped Marilyn into a seated position. This is talking about Lawford, what Lawford did here. Lawford helped Marilyn to a seated position on the bed and did his best to console her. I missed a little bit here. Marilyn's, so basically Bobby barges in. He was a man unburdening himself of a terrible nightmare he kept, oh shit, okay, so we'll get back to the confession here, but I want to fast forward to let you guys know what happened. When they arrived on the evening visit, Marilyn answered the door. Peter Lawford thought she was slightly under the influence of alcohol or drugs, but she was not intoxicated. Almost immediately, the situation became heated as they moved into the living room where Marilyn accused Robert Kennedy and his brother of treating her like a hoe and added that she had had enough of them. So this is the day of in August of 1962 when Marilyn died. This is the alleged this is from the alleged confession of Peter Lawford. Robert said something to the effect of, "What do you want?" That question pushed Marilyn into a tirade. She stepped toward Robert, yelling, "What do I want? What do I want? I don't want to be treated like an effing whore," and ignored. "What do you want?" he asked again with his voice raised. He shook his hand in her face. Marilyn slapped his hand away, and Kennedy slammed Marilyn to the floor near the sofa, leaning over her, screaming profanities and grabbing her flailing arms by the wrist. She struggled free of his grip, slapping him, and raged Kennedy to a point where Lawford believed Kennedy was about to strike her. So shit's really hitting the fan here. Peter grabbed Kennedy from behind and pulling her away. Lawford recalled few of the details of the rest of the argument, but remembered it was heated and involved a physical altercation. So maybe at some point they tried to inject her with something, but that's not mentioned here, like I said. He helped Marilyn to her feet and sat on the sofa while Bobby stormed out of the room and began searching the house through cabinets and drawers while Lawford stayed with Marilyn to try and restrain and calm her. It was understood that Bobby was trying to find, but he wanted her diary and other items linking any connection to Marilyn and the Kennedys. Marilyn pushed Lawford away and stormed into her bedroom where Bobby was rummaging through the dresser. She screamed at him to get out and jerked him away from the dresser. Kennedy angrily spun around and violently pushed Marilyn, causing her to fall onto the bed and tumble onto the floor. Instantly, Kennedy leaned over, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her onto the bed. She was now crying. Kennedy held her down on the bed and repeatedly yelled, "Where is it?" He's talking about the secret diary. He said he had to have it and that he'd pay her. Again, Lawford. So basically, Bobby Kennedy, he's enraged, but he's basically offering Marilyn, a plan B. If you give me this diary, if you shut the hell up, we'll get out of here. We'll just call this a done deal. But it doesn't end so easily. Again, Lawford interceded by pulling Kennedy away. Lawford didn't remember the exact words, but recalled Kennedy leaning over her and screaming something, "You better keep your mouth shut." Marilyn was hysterical and crying when Kennedy stormed out of the bedroom. Lawford was stunned by Kennedy's actions and at a loss to explain his violent outburst. He didn't know what he should do. He helped Marilyn into a seated position on the bed and did his best to console her. He hugged her for several minutes before she pushed him away, stood up, and went in search of Bobby. Peter quickly followed her into the living room, grabbing her and convinced her to sit with him on the sofa. Reluctantly, she complied. He glanced around the room looking for Robert, but didn't see him. He heard a noise in the kitchen and begged Marilyn to remain seated while he spoke to Robert. At this point in our conversation, Lawford paused, dropped his head, and covered his face with his hands. He was silent for several minutes. So this, again, if you're coming in late or you lost track of who the hell we're talking, this is Mike Rothmiller's interview conducted with Peter Lawford where he confesses to what happened on that day. I placed my hand on his shoulder, gently squeezed it, attempting to console him. "What is it?" I asked softly. He remained silent for a few seconds more and said nothing. He rubbed his face, raised his head, and looked straight ahead before taking a deep breath. "Are you okay?" He nodded yes. "I left her on the sofa and went into the kitchen," he said. "Bobby was by the sink. He had a glass of water and was stirring it." Okay, so he's got Bobby Kennedy's in the kitchen with a glass of water, and he's mixed some type of powder into the drink. "Why was he stirring a glass of water?" I asked. "Did he put something in it?" Lawford says, "I asked Bobby, what are you doing?" And so this is a little confusing to read this, but he's basically Lawford is talking and he's answering Rothmiller's questions, but he's also answering Bobby's questions sort of in real time, in reverse. Peter shook his head, implying no. "What do you think he was doing?" I asked. He gazed forward, then looked at me. His expression had changed. He suddenly looked like a man on the verge of crying. He's talking about Lawford here. He took several moments before, in a rear whisper, he said he put something in it. So Lawford is confessing. He's saying that Bobby Kennedy mixed something into Marilyn Monroe's drink. "What was it?" I asked. "I don't know." "Was the water clouded or clear?" "It was clear." "Then what happened?" He took another long pause. I pointed to the glass and asked what was in it. "What did he say?" I asked. "He told me that Kennedy had snapped." "Nothing," Kennedy says. Lawford watched as Kennedy placed the spoon into a drawer and picked up the glass. They remained in the kitchen for a few moments as Lawford repeatedly asked Kennedy what he was doing. He didn't receive an answer. He told Kennedy they had to leave because his neighbors might have heard the yelling and could have called the police. Bobby didn't respond. Marilyn could be heard weeping in the living room. Lawford, clearly pained, recalled that he followed Kennedy as he took the glass and walked into the living room where Marilyn was seated on the sofa, cradling her head. They stood in front of her, and Kennedy extended the glass. "Drink this," Bobby says. "You'll feel better," Kennedy said to Marilyn. She looked up and refused at first, but with Lawford's coaxing, she took a drink and immediately remarked on the unpleasant taste. So it goes on. Lawford indicated that at the time he thought it contained a sedative which would calm her and diffuse the situation. That's very questionable. "Finish it," Kennedy told her. "Hurry up." She glanced up at him and then looked to Lawford, who said, "It's okay." Lawford motioned to the glass. "It's okay, finish it." Now, why Marilyn would have drank this drink is kind of unknown. With that, she finished the drink. To the best of his recollection, Lawford and Kennedy then left Marilyn on the sofa and proceeded to search the other rooms before returning to the living room. So maybe it's possible they weren't trying to necessarily kill her, but maybe just put her to sleep so they could get out of there with the diary or something. That's possible, but that kind of becomes unlikely with the information that he unveils later on. His time frame was sketchy, but he remembers that when they returned to the living room, Marilyn wasn't moving from the sofa. She was leaning back with her head tilted backward. She appeared to be sleeping. Kennedy approached and shook her shoulder until a groggy and obviously drugged Marilyn stirred. Her voice was a whisper, slurred and completely unintelligible. Kennedy shook her again and said something to her that Lawford could not clearly hear. Marilyn mumbled a couple more unintelligible words and appeared to pass out. Kennedy again shook her and said her name, but she didn't respond. It was then they heard a knock on the front door. Lawford feared it was the police. He and Kennedy quickly moved to the living room. He glanced at Marilyn, who was in the same position and clearly unconscious. Her complexion was now waxen. He turned to Kennedy standing nearby and said, "She's not breathing and we need to call an ambulance." "What did Bobby do?" I asked. "Bobby grabbed my arm and said, 'Leave her.' He pulled me toward the front door. With Kennedy standing beside him, Lawford cautiously opened the door and was confronted by two men. Startled, he immediately thought a neighbor, having heard the banging and shouting, had called the police, but the men were not in uniform. So he assumed that they were detectives or CIA agents. For a moment, he thought his life in the world of the Kennedy Camelot was crashing to an end. But really, those two secret agents were members, covert agents of the Organized Crime Intelligence Division that were basically privy to what was going on there. It happened so quickly, but Lawford didn't recall speaking to the men before Kennedy grabbed his arm and promptly guided him to the door. As they passed the men, Kennedy only glanced at them and continued. No words were spoken. As Kennedy hurriedly led Lawford to their car, Lawford asked, "Who are they?" Kennedy only responded, "We must leave." "But Marilyn," Lawford said, looking back. "Let's go," Bobby insisted. He and Bobby entered his car and Lawford drove away. Bobby told him to take him to the airport. Lawford recalled it was eerily quiet during the drive and neither of them spoke. Lawford thought for a moment. "One's a cop. I've seen him with John and Bobby before. I don't know the other. Was the cop named Hamilton?" He raised his hands from his lap in frustration. "I don't know." So that's basically what happened on the day that Marilyn Monroe died. Now, also, we'll talk about this here. So basically that secret drink that was administered by Bobby Kennedy on that fateful day was a sort of a CIA created certified murder weapon. Now, whether or not, it's pretty obvious that Bobby Kennedy showed up to give Marilyn Monroe one last chance to try to make amends or whatever he was planning to do. When that backfired, he had already made his decision, and I don't think he mixed anything into that drink just to put her to sleep. Again, it's possible. Maybe she would have woken up like a vegetable or something, but it's pretty clear they were trying to get rid of her. But basically, this was like a new CIA-invented drug. By the time of Marilyn's death, the CIA's activities, including illegal domestic spying, secret and loosely controlled experiments with drugs, illicit connections to the underworld, and plots to kill various foreign leaders were well underway. Marilyn, if anything, should have been a cameo in such matters. Still, her death was covered up, for the truth would have been much more hugely damning to the Kennedy administration. Theoretically, only a president can approve the assassination of a foreign leader. So these were the drugs that Marilyn was given and ended up killing her were sort of the drugs that were being used, or at least the CIA and rogue government officials were sort of experimenting with these drugs as potential, to assassinate their opponents. So Marilyn being so in such close proximity to the Kennedys probably had all sorts of ways to make something look like a suicide. And then there's some more monologues about Peter Lawford, how he drank himself to death. He was sort of burdened with this guilt of what happened with Marilyn Monroe, right? That seems to be pretty obvious. I probably had a lot of other problems too, just by the CIA's working relationship with LAPD intelligence unit gave officers and agents carte blanche for their activities. It provided complete legal cover from the highest levels of the federal government. And so let's get into, before we kind of, there's some more stuff about the, come on Pete, quiet. The cat's going to ape shit. The diary, the Maryland's Red Diary was regarded as vanished proof of a relationship with an American president and his brother, the National Attorney General. Implicit but unsaid was that it would be a health warning about the toxicity of sleeping with powerful men, but would also provide a clue to her true personality forged by her traumatic childhood and the truth about her death. Here, Rothmiller tells the full story of how we found the diary, the OCID files, and reveals what he was able to copy from it. So just, there's some more, we can't cover everything in this stream tonight, but I encourage you guys to read this book. It's highly interesting, highly entertaining. Well, not entertaining in an uplifting way. So sort of what I garnered from Mike Rothmiller's book is that his thesis is basically that Marilyn was playing willingly with fire. Naivety, and as well as being a scorned woman, led to her demise. And obviously it's much more complicated than that. But Peter Lawford basically broke down in tears after this interrogation, basically said, they didn't have to do this. And Peter Lawford was a broken man from this day forward. We gotta put our annotation back in here about the secret CIA drugs, wherever that is. We'll find that later. So just a little interesting annotation here says JFK's links to Martin Luther King's sexual debauchery, covert spying on Martin Luther King. Again, Martin Luther King was assassinated. So what's kind of adding up here, everybody? All these covert operations, all these, alleged assassinations by lone rogue people like, cunning people like fucking Lee Harvey Oswald, but there's obviously so much more to it. Clearly, JFK's reputation had been tainted by hindsight by his womanizing and constant adultery, but he was not alone among America's leaders in the 1960s for being a sexual cowboy. Documents released in 2019 show behavioral links between JFK and Reverend Martin Luther King. FBI files detail King's wild sexual activities with dozens of women as he crossed America campaigning against racial inequality. Apparently it gets much worse. Martin Luther King looked on, laughed, and offered advice while a friend, a Baptist minister, raped one of his parishioners. The tape said, this is covert tapes that were recorded, show an alleged assault were being held in a 2019 vault under court seal of U.S. National Archives. So, whether or not this is like propaganda or this originated in propaganda to maybe derail Martin Luther King's accomplishments, that's a possibility, but it's well known that Martin Luther King had numerous affairs, right? He was a product of this socio-political corruption. Had arrived at Baltimore Cornerstone Baptist Church, where King arrived in Washington with what an FBI summary described as several women parishioners of his church. Kearse invited King to meet the women in his room, where they discussed which woman among the parishioners would be suitable for natural and unnatural acts. At one point, a senior FBI official, said to be J. Edgar Hoover, sent an incriminating tape and an anonymous letter to King calling him an evil, abnormal beast and warning him that your adulterous acts and your sexual orgies were on the record for all time. The letter ended with a veiled suggestion that King should commit suicide. When King learned of the tape's contents, he is said to have told 1-8 over a wiretapped phone call that the FBI was out to get him, harass him, and break his spirit. So that's a little bit of what you don't hear, about a lot of these powerful individuals. Civil rights leaders, high-profile Democratic heroes like JFK, they had a kind of a secret life. Now, whether or not it was, as bad as books like this are making it out to be is kind of anyone's guess, but it wouldn't surprise me. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So before we close this out here, I appreciate y'all sticking around. Kind of a late night here, but what the hell? It's Friday night. What the hell? I'm glad you guys are here with us. So we talked about we talked about the organized crime intelligence division. We talked about the Kennedys. We talked about the covert operations, the secret handler. But how does this all make sense? And basically how this was, I talked to my dad about this kind of stuff all the time, and he was like, well, to what end? How did they get away with it? Who was behind it? Why would they do this? My dad's a very rational thinking person, and so am I, but, my dad just doesn't really want to sit down and read the evidence. He wants to figure out how to dispel, a controversial theory. But basically, if you guys are familiar with the mafia, they operate in this code known as omerta. I think it might be a Latin word, kind of like the Lamb of God song. Omerta. Anyway, little Lamb of God shout out there. But the mafia works in this code of omerta where they basically refuse to collaborate with authorities. They don't collaborate with the police. They might be collaborating with, law enforcement on some level of covert subterfuge, right? But they're not going to spill the beans on who they had taken out or whatever. And basically the organized crime intelligence division that works with the LAPD basically takes on this heritage of the omerta. And it's all documented here of how this philosophy of the omerta, you could call it anything, you basically just call it covert operations, right? But it's much deeper than that. It's an unspoken code that you do not expose the failings and the corruption of your own police department. It happens today. Every other week on the news we see about police officers getting charged with, whatever, because there's a code of omerta in these secret societies. And I call them secret societies because they're public entities, they're public, they're out in the public, supposedly working for the public, but they work in sort of a secret operation. And the organized crime intelligence division basically adopted this system of omerta. And how does that tie in with Marilyn Monroe? I won't be able to cover all of it tonight. I'll try to read you some stuff here. I do not believe Peter Lawford had advance notice of the plot to silence Marilyn, and I'm convinced Chief William Parker did not know the ultimate plan either, but Captain James Hamilton did. It wasn't necessary for Lawford or Parker to be informed of the ultimate aim. They were likely unwittingly participants, and I believe that the fact haunted Lawford throughout his remaining years. After Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford departed her residence that night for the last time, and Captain James Hamilton and other OCID detectives entered, no one knows all the steps the two cops undertook. Over the years, there have been much speculation about the activities inside her home, but the fact remains that it's pure guesswork. Captain Hamilton and the detective were not so foolish as to write a detailed report or discuss their actions with anyone. Again, that's omerta. From the intelligence reports I reviewed the detectives I spoke about who worked with the OCID at the time, I believe I have the best estimate as to what Hamilton and his colleague did inside her house. Hamilton's primary objective would have been to ensure the cause of death appeared to be an accidental overdose or suicide. Frankly, either would suffice. The two cops methodically staged the bedroom and the body to give this impression. Their second object would be to clear the home of any items related to the Kennedys or photographs, notes, letters, diaries, anything that links Marilyn to the ultimate death. However, the officer became an accessory after the fact and a co-conspirator in other crimes when he and Captain Hamilton staged the death scene and the body. So this is kind of how they did it. There was obviously Peter Lawford, Bobby Kennedy were there. They give Marilyn the secret drink. They take off. Those two secret agents enter to sort of micromanage the crime scene, right? And by the time the other people arrive, the coroner, the psychiatrist, the other officers arrive on the scene, they've already concocted this suicide scenario. They've already, and everybody, it's pretty much like this. everybody's like this. They're not literally doing that, but that's the unspoken code. When they arrive, they do what they're told. They don't question the anything. You guys heard Pete? You guys heard Pete in the background. Yeah, he's going apeshit. Okay, so at that juncture, all those individuals were guilty of a multitude of criminal violations. They were all profoundly involved in the conspiracy, and they were all required to obey the LAPD's code of omerta. So it goes all the way from the top all the way to the bottom and vice versa. And that's basically what I would tell somebody like my dad, is that that's kind of how this stuff works. And then it's also alleged that when Dr. Greenson arrived, after they did the autopsy, Dr. Greenson was seen coming out of the bathroom, pouring powder down the toilet, which is pretty sketchy. They were trying to just erase all evidence of whatever that secret drug was that was given to Marilyn. So I think that's a pretty good place to stop. We pretty much covered the whole. I didn't think it was going to take an hour and a half or almost 2 hours we've been on. But it's pretty dense, but it's not that dense. It's not as dense as some of the works that we're going to be covering in the next couple of weeks. We have some other Dave McGowan stuff coming up. Again, this is a book written by Detective Mike Rothmiller and LAPD somebody Douglas Thompson. So hopefully that sort of offered a new perspective to you guys on the Kennedy Maryland scandal. And like we said, Peter Lawford went on to die a broken man. And it's pretty shocking that he was carrying that burden his entire life. And this book pretty much proves what happened. Any book that was before this, in my opinion, was all sort of speculative hearsay. We had that rumor that Dr. Greenson was the one that caused Maryland to and I don't think any of that was true. How many of those individuals were actually there? Show the a little shot of the books here that we covered. They're all operating under the secret code of omerta, and nobody actually. But this is pretty clear from Peter Lawford's confession that we got in that book. It's pretty. Mike Rothmiller pretty much blew the whole lid off of it, and it was a good time to do it because most of these people are dead now. All the old actors are dead. All the political people are dead. So we're lucky to sort of have this book. And of course, you could be more critical of this book and sort of ask yourself, well, why did Marilyn take that drink? How did they get away with it? Blah, 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 blah. But it's pretty clear what took place on that fateful day in 1962. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you guys have any questions, I'll stay on here and hang out for a second. But that pretty much covers everything. I gotta put my little annotations back in my book here. I thank you all for joining us. My throat is really tired. Now, if anybody out there that you're interacting with, maybe you are Marilyn Monroe fans yourself, maybe you interact, with maybe some of your family members, friends, associates are Marilyn Monroe fans, point them to this stream, at some point, let them watch the replay so that we can kind of keep this conversation going. And, it doesn't stop with Marilyn Monroe. Obviously, covert operations or just mysterious deaths, are still an ongoing thing in the entertainment industry. We just read Britney Spears' book where she documents sort of the ritual abuse that she underwent in the conservatorship. She talks about all kinds of strange things. So, that's why it's good to kind of read stuff like this, even though most people say it's a conspiracy. To me, it just kind of helps me connect the dots. And you can sort of form your own conclusions by reading, text, making your own annotations, and that way you can talk about them and sort of, educate people, So I hope you all have a great weekend. It was a real